What if that nagging feeling in the back of your neck was real? What if those hands reaching out from the dark that you believed were there? What if the monster in the basement really existed? And what if there was really something under the bed? Would you have the courage to face your fears?
Part 1. The Emergency Call. Mike Chen wiped the sweat from his brow as he connected the last connection under Mrs. Harrison's kitchen sink. Just another routine job. Or at least it should have been. But nothing about this Thursday morning felt routine. "Mrs. Harrison?" he called out, sliding out from under the cabinet. "The leak's fixed, but I'm seeing some serious corrosion on these pipes. You might want to consider..." His voice trailed off. The TV in the living room was blaring emergency broadcasts, and Mrs. Harrison hasn't answered his calls for the past 20 minutes. She'd been pacing nervously when she arrived, checking her phone constantly and muttering about her daughter not answering calls from the hospital where she worked. Mike packed his tools slowly, listening to the fragments of news filtered in from the other room. Stay in your homes. Military response. Infection spreading. Avoid all contact. The sound of breaking glass from somewhere down the street made him freeze. Then came the screams. He moved to the window, careful to stay behind the curtain. The suburban street he'd parked on just an hour ago had transformed. A car had crashed into the Johnsons' mailbox. Smoke rose from somewhere in the distance. And people were running. What stopped him cold was Mr. Peterson from across the street. The elderly man who always waved to Mike when he was on a job in the neighborhood was shuffling down his driveway at an unnatural angle. Even from this distance, Mike could see the glistening red down the front of his cardigan, and the way his head twitched and jerked with each step. "Mrs. Harrison!" Mike called again, louder this time, his heart pounding. He moved through the house, tool belt clutched tight in his sweating hands. The master bedroom door was closed. He knocked once, then pushed it open. The bed was empty, but the bathroom door was locked. "Mrs. Harrison, are you okay?" A low moan answered him, followed by a wet cough that made his skin crawl. Mike backed away from the door, his mind racing. He'd seen enough horror movies to recognize what happened, but this was real. This was actually happening. Another crash outside. Closer this time. Mike ran to the front door, throwing the deadbolt and chain into place. His van was still parked in the driveway, tools and supplies inside, but reaching it now seemed impossible as more figures began appearing on the street, all moving with that same wrong rhythm. He had to think fast. Mrs. Harrison's house was solid, brick exterior, strong doors, and he knew the plumbing layout intimately. He had his tools. He had access to water, and he had a choice to make. Try to run, or fortify his position and hope help would come. The sound of splintering wood from the bathroom door made the decision for him. Mike grabbed his heavy pipe wrench and began barricading the front door, trying to forget that his last customer was still in the house. And by the sound of it, she wasn't Mrs. Harrison anymore. Part 2. The first hour. The bathroom door shuddered again, accompanied by another guttural moan. Mike worked fast, his plumber's muscles straining as he dragged Mrs. Harrison's heavy oak dining table across the living room. The legs screamed against the hardwood floor as he positioned it against the front door. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though he wasn't sure he was apologizing to Mrs. Harrison or to himself. The woman who'd offered him coffee just an hour ago was gone. The thing in the bathroom, he could hear it scratching now, wasn't her anymore. Mike's tool belt provided a strange comfort as he moved through the house, securing entry points. Pipe wrenches became door reinforcements. His role as a plumber had trained him to think about the bones of a house, all its secret arteries and access points. Now that knowledge might save his life. The kitchen window looked out over the backyard. 2 houses down, flames licked the sky. The source of the smoke he'd seen earlier. He could hear car alarms, distant gunshots, and the occasional scream. His phone showed no service. but he kept checking it compulsively, desperate to reach out to his sister Janet in Seattle. Crash! The bathroom door had given way. Mike's heart hammered as shuffling footsteps moved down the hallway. He gripped his largest wrench, backing into the kitchen. What emerged from the hallway wore Mrs. Harrison's floral blouse and pearl necklace, but the similarities ended there. Her skin had taken on a grayish tint, and dark fluid leaked from her nose and mouth. Her movements were jerky, primitive, as her head snapped toward him with unseeing eyes. Mike had spent countless hours in this house fixing leaks and replacing pipes. He knew every corner, every crawl space. As Mrs. Harrison lurched toward him, he ducked through the laundry room door, slamming it behind him. The washer and dryer were on wheels. He'd helped her install them himself last year. With a grunt, he shoved them against the door. The basement door was right there. He could hear Mrs. Harrison's body thudding against the laundry room door. But the washer and dryer would hold. For now. Mike flicked his headlamp, never far from his belt, and descended the basement stairs. His boots left muddy prints of the steps he'd carefully avoided tracking on during countless service calls. Professional courtesies seemed absurd now, but old habits died hard. The basement would be safer than the main floor, and he knew exactly how to secure it. But first, he had to make a decision about Mrs. Harrison. He couldn't leave her up there, prowling the house. Eventually, she'd find a way down, or worse, attract others with her noise. He checked his tool belt, taking inventory of potential weapons. The pipe wrench was hefty, but using it would mean getting too close. His eyes fell on the gas line he'd installed last winter. An idea formed. A terrible one. But perhaps his only option. Mike took a deep breath, testing the weight of the wrench in his hands. He'd fixed countless problems in this house over the years. Now, for the first time, he was going to have to break something. Or someone instead. Part 3. The Hard Choice. The basement's familiar smell of concrete and copper pipes had never felt so comforting. Mike moved methodically through his options, his mind working like it did when diagnosing a complex plumbing problem. Above, he could hear Mrs. Harrison's shambling footsteps punctuated by inhuman groans. The gas line caught his attention again. It would be easy, too easy, to create a leak, but the thought of burning down his client's house made him sick. Besides, in this neighborhood of closely packed homes, a fire could spread rapidly. He'd seen enough disaster through the kitchen window to know he couldn't risk adding to it. His headlamp beam caught the reflection of his favorite tool mounted on the wall, a heavy-duty pipe snake. He'd left it here last month after clearing the main sewer line, telling Mrs. Harrison he'd pick it up during his next service call. The industrial-grade steel cable was nearly 20 feet long when fully extended. A plan formed, though his stomach churned at the thought of it. Mike worked quickly, using his knowledge of the house's layout to his advantage. He secured one end of the pipe snake to the sturdy main water line, then fed the cable out through the basement stairs. The coiled steam gleamed in the headlight's beam as he created a snare at the other end. "I'm sorry," he whispered again, then pulled out his phone. He cranked the volume to maximum and played the first song that came up. Some pop hit his sister had put on there. The tinny music echoed through the basement. The shuffling upstairs changed direction immediately. Mike positioned himself behind the basement door, which he'd left partially open. His hands were sweating as he gripped the snake's control wheel, waiting. Mrs. Harrison appeared at the top of the stairs, her once kindly face now a mask of mindless hunger. She started down, drawn by the music. 5 steps. 8. 10. Mike hit the basement light switch, plunging everything into darkness except his headlamp. Mrs. Harrison jerked toward the new movement. That's when Mike threw the snare, years of feeding pipe snakes through complicated plumbing systems paying off in one crucial moment. The cable wrapped around her legs. Mike yanked hard on the control wheel, and Mrs. Harrison tumbled down the remaining stairs. Before she could right herself, he had her fully entangled in the industrial cable. But restraining her wasn't enough. He knew that now. The sounds from outside were getting worse. More screams, more breaking glass, more chaos. He couldn't risk keeping her alive, not when every sound could attract more of them. Mike picked up his heaviest pipe wrench. Mrs. Harrison snapped her teeth at him, straining against the steel wheel. "Thank you for always having coffee ready for me when I came to work," he said softly. "Thank you for recommending me to your friends. Thank you for trusting me with your home." The wrench came down hard. One blow was all it took. After Mike sat on the bottom step, shaking. He'd never killed anything bigger than a spider before today. But there was no time to process what he'd done. The world was falling apart upstairs, and he needed to focus on survival. He still had to secure the basement, inventory his supplies, and figure out a way to get a signal on his phone. Most importantly, he needed to check the house's water supply and filtration system. In a zombie apocalypse, a plumber's skills might just prove invaluable, if he could keep it together long enough to use them. Wiping his eyes, Mike stood up. There was work to be done, and for once, he couldn't afford to be professional about it. Part 4. The Fortress. Mike's hands had stopped shaking by the time he finished wrapping Mrs. Harrison's body in a paint tarp from his tool bag. He'd moved her to the far corner of the basement, behind the water heater. It felt wrong to leave her there, but he had no better options. The basement was becoming his fortress. Years of service calls had left him intimately familiar with every pipe, every junction, every potential weakness. Now, that knowledge was being repurposed for survival. First, he addressed the basement windows. They were small, but still vulnerable. Using his pipe wrench, he carefully removed sections of copper pipe from the basement's exposed plumbing, non-essential lines he knew the house could do without. He measured and cut them precisely, creating a grid of copper bars across each window. His torch made quick work of soldering them in place. "Janet would laugh if she could see me now," he muttered, thinking of his sister's constant teasing about his methodical nature. The same attention to detail that made him a good plumber might just keep him alive. The water heater caught his attention next. He'd installed it last year, a 60-gallon behemoth that now represented a precious resource. The city water might fail eventually, but he could keep his tank full and separate from the main supply if needed. He began modifying the intake valve, creating a closed system he could control. A sudden crash from upstairs made him freeze. Multiple impacts followed, along with the sound of breaking glass. Something, or several somethings, had made it into the house. Mike quickly finished his work on the water heater and killed his headlamp. In the darkness, he could hear them moving around upstairs. The laundry room barricade held, but the sounds were coming from another direction. Probably the kitchen window he hadn't time to secure. He did a quick inventory of his supplies. Tool belt, full complement of wrenches and pliers, blowtorch, spare copper pipe, solder, his emergency water supply from the van. He'd grabbed it during his initial sprint inside, and various repair parts and fixtures. In his pockets, he had a granola bar, his phone, still no signal, and Mrs. Harrison's house keys. The basement also held a wealth of resources. The water heater, of course, but also cleaning supplies, some canned food Mrs. Harrison kept on wooden shelves, and a collection of garden tools. Mike's eyes lingered on a rusty shovel. He told her last month she should replace it. Now it might serve a different purpose. More crashes upstairs. They were exploring the house, moving room to room. Mike's modifications to the basement door would hold. He had reinforced it with strips of metal and additional locks he'd scavenged from other doors in the house. But the sounds above were increasing. More were coming. He needed a way to monitor what was happening upstairs, and that's when he remembered the central vacuum system he'd held repair last summer. The pipes ran through the walls, connecting to outlets in every room. With some modification, they could serve as listening posts. Mike reached for his tools again. If he was going to be trapped down here, he needed every advantage he could create. The world above was becoming a nightmare, but down here, surrounded by pipes and tools and problems he knew how to solve, he still had a chance. He just hoped Janet was safe in Seattle. If only he could get signal. Find out what was happening outside this basement. For now, though, all he could do was prepare. The sounds above grew louder, and Mike Chen, master plumber, and began to modify a vacuum system into a surveillance network. Part 5. The Signal. The modified vacuum pipes worked better than Mike had expected. By cutting specific sections and creating resonance chambers from PVC connectors, he'd essentially built a network of acoustic scopes throughout the house. Each outlet provided a listening post for a different room, and he'd labeled them with a silver Sharpie. Kitchen, living room, master bath. It had been 6 hours since he'd barricaded himself in the basement. The sounds above had changed from chaotic movement to occasional shuffling. He counted at least 4 distant sets of footsteps. None of them belonged to anything human anymore. Mike sat with his back against the water heater, letting its warmth seep into his tired muscles. He'd been rotating through his listening posts every 15 minutes, mapping the movements above. The zombies seemed drawn to any sound, but quickly lost interest when stopped. They weren't hunting exactly, just reacting. His phone buzzed. Mike nearly dropped it in surprise. For hours, the device had been useless, but now a single bar flickered in the corner. His hand shook as he pulled up his messages. A text from Janet loaded. Mike? Cell tower spotty. Military controlling Seattle Center. Safe in hospital with Sarah. Please be alive. Sarah was Janet's girlfriend, a nurse. They'd been working the same shift when everything started. Mike's eyes blurred with tears as he typed back. Alive. Trapped in client's basement. Harrison House on Oak Street. City's gone crazy. Stay safe. The message didn't send immediately. He watched the project circle spin, praying the signal would hold. A new sound caught his attention, different from the shuffling above. He moved to his listening posts, checking each one until he found it. Through the living room outlet came a whispered voice. Anyone alive in there? We saw someone moving around earlier. Mike's heart raced. Using a small mirror he'd unscrewed from Mrs. Harrison's bathroom cabinet, he angled it under the basement window's copper bars. In the fading evening light, he could make out 2 figures crouched behind the hedges. They were human. A man and a teenage girl, both carrying backpacks. He wanted to call out to them, but the zombies upstairs would hear. Instead, he remembered something else. The irrigation system. He'd installed the sprinkler controller in the garage last spring, and the main line. Mike traced the pipe along the basement wall until he found the valve he needed. With a few careful turns, he sent a short pulse of water to the front yard sprinklers. 3 quick bursts. A signal. Through his listening post, he heard the girl whisper, Dad, look! Mike sent another 3 bursts. Then, using his pipe system, he could hear them quietly making their way around the basement window. Hello? The man whispered through the narrow gap. Someone in there? Yes, Mike whispered back. The house isn't safe. 4 infected upstairs. I'm secure down here. Who are you? Tom Smith, from the hardware store in Maple. This is my daughter, Lucy. We've been moving house to house since this morning, looking for other survivors. Mike's breath caught. He knew Tom. Had bought supplies from his stores for years. More importantly, Tom would understand construction, tools, structures. They could work together. His phone buzzed again. Janet's message had finally sent, and her reply came through. Come in to get you. Sarah knows back roads. 2 days max. Stay alive. Mike looked at his copper-barred windows, then back at the shadows of Tom and Lucy. He had water, some food, and a secure position. But getting them safely inside without letting the infected know? That would take some creative plumbing. Part 6. The Solution. Mike stared at the home's blueprints he'd found tucked behind the water heater, his headlamp illuminating the faded lines. He'd studied these same drawings countless times over the years while updating the house's plumbing, but never with such desperate purpose. Tom, he whispered through the window grating. You know that big drainage pipe on the north side of the house? The one hidden behind the rhododendrons? Tom's voice was barely audible. I see it. It's not for show. Mike traced a line on the blueprint with his finger. This house was built in the 1920s. They used to have a coal chute that connected to the basement. When I modernized the plumbing, I repurposed the old chute housing for drainage, but the original tunnel is still there behind the pipe. Lucy's whisper came next. You want us to remove the drain pipe? Your dad's hardware store stock should have taught you how to handle PVC, Mike said. I'll guide you through it. He glanced at his phone. Still 1 bar of signal, and Janet's last message glowing on the screen. 18 hours away. Road's bad. Coming. They had to work fast. The daylight was fading, and the infected upstairs were getting more active with the approaching night. Through his vacuum pipe network, Mike could hear them growing restless, their movements more frequent, more agitated. Tom and Lucy worked silently but efficiently. Mike talked them through each step, removing the external PVC drain pipe, locating the hidden access panel he'd installed years ago, and finally exposing the narrow concrete tunnel that had once accepted coal deliveries. The passage would be tight, designed for coal, not people, but it was their best chance. Mike had already started widening the basement end, carefully chipping away concrete with borrowed tools from Mrs. Harrison's garden collection. A sudden crash from upstairs made them all freeze. Through his listening network, Mike heard multiple steps of shuffling feet heading toward the front of the house, something that caught their attention. Now! Mike hissed through the window. It has to be now! Lucy went first, being the smallest. The sound of her squeezing through the narrow tunnel seemed deafening to Mike's heightened senses, but his surveillance system told him the infected hadn't noticed. Tom followed, his broader shoulders scraping concrete, making Mike wince with each sound. Just as Tom's feet disappeared into the tunnel, a new sound erupted from the street. Engines. Through his mirror, Mike caught glimpses of movement at the end of the block. The infected upstairs charged toward the front of the house, drawn by the noise. Mike helped Tom through the basement end of the tunnel, then quickly sealed it behind them. Above, the sounds of vehicles grew closer, accompanied by shouts, and suddenly, gunshots. Military? Lucy whispered. Mike shook his head. Janet, my sister. She's a hospital administrator in Seattle. She and her girlfriend must have found others. Organized. He swallowed hard. But they're too early. They're still 18 hours out according to her last text. Then who's up there? Tom asked. Through his listening posts, Mike could hear engines idling, voices calling out, zombies being shot. But something felt wrong. These weren't rescue workers. The voices were too excited, too chaotic. Scavengers, Mike realized. Raiders taking advantage of the chaos. And they're drawing every infected in the neighborhood right to us. Lucy clutched her father's arms. What do we do? Mike looked around his basement fortress, at the copper-barred windows, the modified water systems, the surveillance network he'd built. Then he looked at his phone, at Janet's promise. We wait, he said, pulling out his blueprint of the house's plumbing system. And we prepare, because in 18 hours, we'll need to get from this basement to the street alive. He spread the blueprint on the floor, gesturing for Tom and Lucy to join him. I've got some ideas about how we can use the house's water pressure to our advantage. Tom, how much do you know about hydraulics? Outside, engines revved and gunshots echoed. Above, the infected prowled. But in the basement, 3 survivors huddled around a blueprint, planning, adapting, surviving. Mike Chen, the plumber who'd fixed his house so many times before, now prepared to use the same skills to save the lives within. All they had to do was hold on for 18 more hours, and if anyone could keep a house's system running that long, it was Mike. Part 7. Raiders. Water pressure's holding at 55 psi, Mike whispered, checking the gauge he'd installed in the main line. Perfect for what we need. The basement had changed in the 6 hours since Tom and Lucy arrived. Copper pipes now crisscrossed the ceiling in a complex pattern that would have baffled most plumbers. Each line had been carefully pressure tested, modified, and fitted with quick-release valves. Tom's hardware store experience had proved invaluable. He understood flow rates and pressure tolerances almost as well as Mike did. Lucy sat at their makeshift monitoring station, cycling through the vacuum pipe listening posts. She developed an ear for the different types of movements above. The stumbling shuffle of the infected versus the deliberate steps of the raiders who now occupied the first floor. "They're getting frustrated," she reported, keeping her voice low. "I think they know there is a basement, but they haven't found the entrance behind the washer and dryer." Mike nodded grimly. The raiders had moved into the house 3 hours ago, shooting 2 infected that had remained inside and setting up some kind of base. Through the listening posts, they'd heard enough to know this wasn't a simple scavenging group. They were organized, armed, and planning something bigger. "How's our timeline looking?" Tom asked, finishing the last connection on what they'd started calling the sprinkler defense system. Mike checked his phone. The signal had stabilized enough for sporadic texts with Janet. "She's making better time than expected. Maybe 12 hours out. They've got a convoy of medical staff and some police escorts." A loud bang from upstairs made them all jump. Through the listening post came a gruff voice. "This blueprint shows a basement access. Find it. The medical supplies have to be down there. No one boards up windows this well just to leave." Mike exchanged glances with Tom and Lucy. They hadn't wanted to use their defenses so soon. Every system they'd rigged was intended for their escape when Janet arrived. Using them now might reveal their tricks too early. But they were out of options. "Lucy," Mike said quietly, "what did you tell me about the raiders' weapons?" "Mostly shotguns and handguns," she whispered. "One rifle. They were complaining about running low on ammo." Mike nodded, reaching for the main pressure valve. "Then let's show them why you don't mess with the plumber's house." Above them, the laundry room barricade began to shake as the raiders finally found the basement entrance. But Mike Chen allowed himself a small smile. He hadn't spent 20 years learning how water moves through a house just to let some raiders take his fortress. They were about to learn that in the right hands, water pressure could be just as dangerous as bullets. Part 8. The Defense. "Remember in-ground sprinklers?" Mike asked as footsteps thundered down the basement stairs. "How you have to be careful with the pressure because the spray could take off your skin?" Tom's eyes widened with understanding. He positioned himself by the secondary valve cluster they'd installed, hands ready. Lucy remained at the listening post, monitoring the raiders' movements through the modified vacuum system. "6 of them," she whispered. 3 on the stairs. 3 still up top." The basement door shuddered. They had reinforced it after Mrs. Harrison incident, but it wouldn't hold forever. Mike could hear the raiders arguing about whether to shoot the lock. "Save the ammo," a voice commanded. "Just break it down." Mike smiled grimly. They wanted to conserve ammunition. Perfect. The first impact against the door made dust shower from the frame. Mike turned to Lucy. "Remember what I taught you about water heater bypass?" She nodded, moving to position. Crash! The door splintered inward, but didn't break. They'd hit it with something heavy, probably Mrs. Harrison's antique coffee table from the living room. Mike winced at the destruction of his client's furniture, then focused on the task at hand. "Flow check," he whispered to Tom. "All lines pressurized," Tom confirmed. "Jerry-rigged manifold holding steady." Another crash against the door. Wood splintered through the widening gaps. Flashlight beams swept the darkness. Mike had positioned them carefully. All the raiders would see an empty basement corner, their own lights reflecting off the copper pipes that now wrapped the ceiling like a maze. "One more hit should do it," a raider called. Mike took a deep breath. "Lucy, kill the bypass." She turned the valve, redirecting the water heater's full pressure into their modified pipe network. 60 gallons at maximum PSI, no longer held back by residential safety regulators. The door exploded inwards. 3 raiders charged through with raised weapons. Mike yanked the main release. The ceiling erupted. Every modified pipe joint released simultaneously, creating a cross-hatching pattern of pressurized water jets that filled the basement entrance with a horizontal waterfall. The raiders didn't even have time to scream. The pressure caught them full force, slamming them back up the stairs like ragdolls. "Tom, second sequence!" Tom opened the secondary valves. The water's path changed, now shooting through carefully aimed pipes that covered every approach to the basement. Above, they could hear the raiders cursing and sputtering. "You like that?" Mike shouted, pride creeping into his voice. "That's a certified plumber's work. Every pipe rated for twice the pressure you just felt." "You crazy bastard," one of the raiders yelled down. "We just want the medical supplies." "There aren't any," Mike yelled. "Just a plumber, his tools, and enough water pressure to tear the skin off anyone who comes down these stairs." Through the listening post, Lucy heard hurried conversations from above. Words like, "not worth it," and "find another house," drifted down. The raiders were weighing their options, probably realizing that storming a basement rigged by someone who understood hydraulic physics might be more trouble than it was worth. But Mike knew they weren't safe yet. He'd just shown his best defense. If the raiders decided to wait them out, or worse, if they'd decided to respond with real violence. His phone vibrated. A text from Janet. 10 hours out. Roads clearer than expected. Hold on." Mike looked at his pressure gauge. They had enough water for 3 more full pressure blasts. After that, they'd be down to garden hose levels, enough to annoy raiders, but not stop them. They needed a new plan, one that would keep them alive for 10 more hours. And as Mike stared at the network of pipes overhead, watching water drip from the spent joints, an idea began to form. It was risky, maybe even crazy. But then again, this whole day had been crazy. He turned to Tom and Lucy, a glint in his eye. "Either of you ever wonder what happens when you run copper pipes in a circuit board?" Above them, the raiders began to regroup. But Mike Chen, master plumber turned apocalypse survivor, was already planning his next move. Sometimes, he realized, the best defense wasn't just water. It was knowing how to direct it. Part 9. The Circuit. Every modern house has the same weakness, Mike explained, sketching quickly on the back of a supply receipt. The electrical panel. And what's the one thing that short circuits faster than anything? "Water," Tom said. Then his eyes widened. "But the basement's already soaked. Why aren't we seeing sparks?" Mike grinned. "Because I killed the main breaker before you arrived. First rule of plumbing. Don't electrocute yourself. But now..." He glanced at his phone. Janet's last update showed 9 hours until rescue. Now, maybe we want sparks. Lucy, still monitoring the vacuum pipe network, raised her hand for silence. Through the listening ports came the raiders' voices, clearer now that they'd moved to the kitchen above. "Got more guns in the truck. We're not letting some pipe jockey make us look stupid. Boss wants this whole block cleared by morning. What about the zombies we saw on Oak Street? That's why we need this basement. Defensible position, good sight lines. We clear the house, signal the main group." Mike's blood ran cold. These weren't just raiders. They were advanced scouts for something bigger. His neighborhood was about to become someone's territory. "Okay," he whispered, pointing to his sketch. "The house's electrical panel is behind the laundry room wall. If we can channel water through the wall cavity and hit it right when they restore power, they'll trip every breaker in the house," Tom finished. "Won't that leave us in the dark too?" Mike patted his headlamp. Plumber's best friend. Never work a job without one. He turned to Lucy. "Remember those garden spotlights we saw through the window? The ones with the solar panels?" Lucy nodded. "Battery backup. Basic DC unit. Smart girl, Tom. Your hardware store sells those LED strips for under cabinet lighting." "Got some in my pack. Emergency lighting for wherever we ended up." Mike's plan was coming together. "Here's what we need. Tom, rig those LED strips to the solar batteries. Lucy, help me modify these pipes. We're going to create a charge perimeter. When they hit the lights, they'll think the power is on everywhere, but we'll control exactly what's juiced and what doesn't." They worked quickly, listening to the raiders moving supplies into the house above. The sound of boots on hardwood made Mike wince. Mrs. Harrison had been so proud of those floors. He pushed the thought away, focusing on the task. Copper pipes, normally used to deliver water, became electrical conduits. The LED strips, designed for kitchen ambiance, were repurposed into warning lights. Every puddle from their earlier defense became a potential conductor. "Movement outside," Lucy reported from her post. "They're bringing in more people. Heavy gear." Mike checked his work. The modified plumbing now formed a crude but effective electrical grid through the basement. If his calculations were right, anyone coming down those stairs would be in for a real shock. Literally. His phone buzzed. Janet. 8 hours. Found more survivors. Coming in force. Another crash from above, followed by the distinctive sound of a power meter being opened. They were going to restore electricity to the house. "Places," Mike whispered. Tom and Lucy moved to their positions, away from any standing water. Mike took one last look at his creation, a maze of copper, water, and jerry-rigged electronics that would have given any building inspector a heart attack. But building codes didn't matter anymore. Only survival did. Above, a switch flipped. Electricity hummed through the house's wiring, and in the basement of Mrs. Harrison's house, a plumber's knowledge of how things flowed, whether water or electrons, was about to prove deadly. Mike reached for his master valve. Let's show them happens when you mix the utilities without a permit. Part 10. The Surge. The basement erupted in a display that would have made any electrical inspector faint. The moment power surged through the house's wiring, Mike's modified pipe network came alive. Copper conduits sparked and sizzled, creating a web of crackling electricity that reflected off the pooled water from their earlier defense. Above, the raiders had just enough time to realize their mistake. "Jesus Christ, kill the power!" someone screamed. But it was too late. The electrical panel, deliberately soaked by Mike's precise plumbing modifications, exploded in a shower of sparks. The surge traveled through every wet surface, following paths Mike had carefully created with his copper pipe network. The basement stairs, still dripping from the water defense, became a conductor's paradise. Two raiders who'd been preparing to descend went down hard, their boots squelching in electrified puddles, the house's lights strobing wildly before plunging into darkness. All except for Tom's LED strips, powered by the solar batteries, which cast an eerie blue glow through the basement. "Still with me?" Mike whispered to his companions. "That was terrifying," Lucy answered from her monitoring station. "But effective. They're pulling back, dragging their people out." Tom checked their defensive setup. "Main breaker's fried, just like you planned. They won't be restoring power again." Mike allowed himself a moment of professional satisfaction. Plumbing and electrical work weren't supposed to mix. That was a code violation 101. But sometimes breaking the rules paid off. His satisfaction was short-lived, though. Through Lucy's listening post came an ominous sound. Breaking glass. Lots of it. "They're smashing windows," Lucy reported. "All of them. Why would they... Oh no." The sound hit them next. Moans. Shuffling feet. The distinctive noises of the infected had been drawn by the earlier commotion. The raiders were letting them in. "Clever bastards," Mike muttered. "They can't get down there themselves, so they're flooding the house with zombies, trying to flush us out." His phone vibrated. Janet. 7 hours. Encountered roadblocks. Working around it. "We need to think fast," Tom said, watching the ceiling as the heavy footsteps, both coordinated and shambling, moved across the floor above. "That electrical trick won't work on zombies. They don't care about shocks." Mike moved to his blueprint of the house's plumbing system, mind racing. They had limited water pressure left after their earlier defense, and now the infected were being deliberately herded into the house. The raiders would just wait outside, ready to pick them off when they inevitably had to emerge. But as he stared at the blueprint, something caught his eye. An old notation he'd made years ago, back when he'd first started working on this house. Original well system, cap 1975. "Lucy," he called quietly, "what did your dad teach you about well pressure?" "That it's different from municipal systems. More variable. Sometimes builds up pockets of..." Her eyes widened. "Are you thinking what I think you're thinking?" Mike nodded grimly. "Tom, remember those gas lines we didn't use earlier? Bring him here. If we can tap into the old well system, add some pressure from our remaining water supply, and create the right kind of vacuum seal, we can make a bomb, Tom finished. A big one. Not just a bomb, Mike corrected, already reaching for his pipe wrench. A targeted pressure explosion that'll clear the house, but leave the structure intact. If we do it right, we might even take out some raiders in the process. Above them, the infected grew more numerous. Through the listening posts, they could hear the raiders calling to each other, setting up positions around the house. They thought they had won. They thought they had outsmarted the plumber and his friends. But they didn't understand the power of trap pressure. They didn't know what happened when you mixed old systems with new ones. Didn't respect the raw force that built up underground over decades. Mike Chen did. And he was about to show them why you should never underestimate someone who knows how things flow. We've got one shot at this, he told his companions. Let's make it count. Part 11. The Pressure. The old well access was right where Mark remembered it, hidden behind a false panel he'd installed years ago. As he and Tom carefully removed the cap, the pipe released a deep groan. Decades of trapped pressure finally finding voice. The house sits on limestone, Mike explained, connecting their jerry-rigged pressure gauge to the well pipe. Lots of underground spaces. When they capped this well, they didn't properly release the built-up gases and pressure pockets. A rookie mistake, but lucky for us. Lucy's voice came urgent from the listening post. They're getting closer. The infected. There must be dozens up there. The gauge needle jumped erratically as Mike opened the valve slightly. Tom whistled at the reading. That's way above safety specs. Add our remaining water pressure, the gas lines, and the vacuum seals. Mike did quick calculations in his head. We'll have enough force to clear the first floor completely, but timing will be crucial. They worked quickly, converting their defensive plumbing network into something new. Every pipe, every connection had to be perfect. One leak would ruin everything, or worse, cause the explosion to back up into the basement. Mike's phone buzzed again. Janet. Hit serious trouble. 9 hours now. I'm sorry. More time to fill. More infected shuffling above. Through the listening posts, they could hear the raiders calling out to each other, confident in their strategy. They'd positioned shooters around the house, ready to pick off anyone who tried to escape the growing horde of zombies inside. Almost ready, Mike muttered, making the final connections. Lucy, status report. Most of the infected are concentrated in the living room and kitchen. Raiders have split into 3 groups outside. Front yard, back door, and side garden. Perfect. The pressure bomb would hit the areas with the most zombies hardest, and the concussive force through the windows might catch some raiders too. Tom, pressure reading. Gauge is maxed out. Whatever's down in that well, it wants out. Mike nodded grimly. His entire career had been about controlling flow. Water, gas, waste. Everything had its channels, its proper paths. But now he was about to release something that had been building up for nearly 50 years. Lucy, seal the listening posts. Tom, final checks on the blast shields. They'd used everything they could find. Mattresses, Mrs. Harrison's solid oak dining table, filing cabinets, to create protection from the coming explosion. A thunderous crash from above made them all jump. Through the ceiling came the sound of splintering wood. The infected had broken through some interior wall. Now or never, Mike said, reaching for the master valve. This would release everything. Well pressure, gas, water, and vacuum. In a precisely controlled explosion. If his calculations were wrong, if any single pipe failed. Another crash above, closer. Mike took a deep breath. Mrs. Harrison, he whispered, I'm about to void every warranty on every job I ever did for you. He turned the valve. For one moment, nothing happened. Then the pipes began to sing, a high wailing sound as the pressure built through the network. The gauge needles all spun past their red lines, the basement filled with the deep groaning of copper and PVC being pushed to their limits. Cover! Mike shouted, diving behind their blast shield with Tom and Lucy. The explosion came not as a single blast, but as a series of controlled detonations, just as he designed. The first burst blew out through the kitchen, using the gas lines there to amplify the force. The second followed the water pipes into the living room, turning the trapped pressure into a weapon. The house seemed to inhale, all the air rushing toward the points of explosion. Then came the release. The blast lifted infected off their feet, sending them flying through the windows and doors. The pressure wave rolled through the house like a tide, following the paths Mike had created with his pipe network. Years of professional knowledge. Where to put joints, how to angle connections, proper pipe spacing, turned destructive force into something almost surgical. Through it all, the basement held. Mike's reinforcements kept the worst of the explosion contained to the first floor, channeling it outward rather than down. When the dust settled, the silence was absolute, until... Holy shit, Lucy whispered from behind the blast shield. It actually worked. Mike was already moving into the listening posts, checking each one. Most of the pipes had survived, giving them ears on what remained of the first floor. Nothing. No shuffling, no moans, no Raider radio chatter. His phone lit up. Janet, heard explosions from miles away. What did you do? Please be alive. Mike looked at his companions, then at the basement that had kept them safe, now modified almost beyond recognition, with its maze of pipes and improvised engineering. We're alive, he typed back. House is mostly standing. Probably lost my plumbing license, but he managed a small smile. Got some great experience with pressure systems. Above them, through the settling dust and debris, came a new sound. Vehicles approaching. But not the Raiders trucks. Something bigger. Something military. Mike checked his phone one last time. Janet, that's our convoy you hear. 5 minutes out. Hold on. He turned to Lucy and Tom. Ready to go greet my sister? Just watch your step upstairs. I think I avoided the floor's warranty. Part 12. The Aftermath. Mike stood in Mrs. Harrison's kitchen, or what remained of it, and surveyed his handiwork. Sunlight streamed through the shattered windows, illuminated the destruction his pressure bomb had caused. The copper pipes he'd installed over years of service call now jutted from the walls at odd angles, their endings torn and twisted by the controlled explosions. You know, came a familiar voice from behind him, when I taught you about pressure systems in trade school, this isn't exactly what I had in mind. He turned to find Janet standing in the doorway, still wearing her hospital administrator's badge, now accessorized with what looked like tactical gear. Her girlfriend Sarah stood behind her, medical kit in hand, looking professionally concerned at the devastation. Had to improvise, Mike said, gesturing at the chaos around them. Janet's laugh caught in her throat as she rushed toward him. I counted 12 dead Raiders outside. Triple that number of infected. All taken out by plumbing? And a 50-year-old well system that really needed servicing, Mike added, hugging her back. Tom and Lucy helped. They're outside talking to your convoy team. Sarah was examining the modified pipe network with professional interest. This actually probably saved lives beyond just yours. That Raider group was hitting suburbs all across the county. They're well organized, well armed. Been giving the emergency response teams hell. Mike nodded toward the basement door. Still got all my tools down there. Figure they'll be needed. Wherever we're headed next. World's falling apart. Someone's got to keep the water flowing. About that, Janet said, a familiar gleam in her eye. The hospital set up a safe zone. Military protection. Good walls. But the infrastructure's ancient. Plumbing's barely handling the load with all the refugees. Could really use someone who knows their way around pipes. And hardware, Mike added. Tom's expertise could be invaluable. And Lucy's got a better ear for trouble than anyone I've ever met. Through the broken window came the sounds of the convoy preparing to move out. Military vehicles, ambulances, and retrofitted civilian trucks lined the street. The soldiers were efficient, professional, already cataloging supplies and checking buildings. Mike took one last look around the house he'd maintained for so many years. Every pipe, every connection held a memory. Routine maintenance calls, emergency leaks, casual conversations with Mrs. Harrison's over coffee. Now those same pipes had saved lives, turned a simple basement into a fortress. They walked out together into the morning sun. The convoy was almost ready to move. Tom and Lucy waved from one of the trucks, their faces showing the same mix of exhaustion and relief Mike felt. "So," Janet said as they walked with the vehicles, "tell me about this pressure bomb. From a purely theoretical, definitely not going to replicate it perspective." Mike smiled, falling into the familiar rhythm of explaining fluid dynamics to his sister. Around them, soldiers secured the area, medics treated survivors, and life continued. Different, but persisting. He'd lost his van, and probably his license, but he'd kept his skills, his family, and found new friends. In a world where everything was falling apart, knowing how to put things back together, whether pipes, people, or communities, might just be the most valuable skill of all. And if anyone needed proof that a plumber's knowledge could save lives, well, they could just take a look at Mrs. Harrison's house, still standing beside it all, with its basement fortress and its warranty-voided modifications. Sometimes, Mike reflected as he climbed in the convoy truck, the best solutions weren't in any manual. Sometimes you just have to trust your training, break a few codes, and hope the pressure held. Well, I hope you enjoyed that one. That story was originally going to end with Mike and Lucy and Tom in the basement while the raiders were going to raid them or come after them. But I couldn't split this story into two, and I couldn't just leave it hanging like I did with the military veteran story. So I figured I'd finish the whole thing, and I really like the way this came out. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Come back next time for some more scary stories. And as always, remember to face your fears.